Moving on, let's talk about one last organizational characteristic and two individual traits. We've already talked about truth-telling, curiosity, and radical fairness, but let's turn now to the concept of organizational trust. In 2019, Gallup did a study that indicated that only 1 out of 3 employees said they trust their leadership. So that means that we have 67% of employees saying, you know what, I'm not quite sure whether they're doing the right thing for me. Now, what was interesting about this study was that the results ranged quite a bit depending on industry and on company. Some scored as low as 1 in 10, and some scored very high, where there were 7 in 10 employees who had organizational trust. So, of course, that begs the question, what is it that employees who are in that higher range want from their leadership, and how can organizations and organizational leaders do things to make sure to increase that level of trust? Well, one area that we know is incredibly important when it comes to creating trust, or conversely, mistrust, is how organizations are handling the very topics that we will be covering today. Do employees sense fairness and transparency and consistency when it comes to issues related to workplace complaints? Let's transition now to talk about individual characteristics now that we have covered the organizational traits that are most important. And I've provided you with a downloadable that lists the top 10 traits for workplace sleuths. You see them coming up on the screen now, and I would encourage you to not only review this for yourself, but frankly, distribute it to all your leaders. These are common leadership characteristics, but are especially important for leaders, all of whom will at some point receive concerns or complaints from employees. But for purposes of this course, I want to focus in on 2 of the characteristics, and that is the balance between process and judgment, and making sure that you are aware of potential unconscious or implicit biases. Let's start first with the concept of balance in your investigations. A lot of people ask me if I can simply provide them with a checklist or a process that will allow them to conduct investigations or to receive complaints or to resolve them in the same way each time. And certainly having a process in place, making sure that you are consistent, is vital to the idea of fairness. But what I really want to focus on is this idea that you also need to combine this with your good judgment, your common sense, and your sense of fairness. Because here's the thing, no 2 investigations are alike. Whether this is your 10th, your 50th, or your 500th investigation, none of these are cookie cutters. And in fact, for the person who was courageous enough to come to you with their concerns, expecting to get some help resolving these issues, this is the most important thing going on in his or her life. And so by taking the approach that is rigid and saying, I need to follow a consistent process and essentially do the same thing each time, the message that you're sending to both the individual employee who came to you, but also everyone else in the workplace is, I'm not really hearing you. You don't really have a voice here. And in fact, your stories are being erased. So the next individual characteristic that I want to cover is making sure that you're aware of unconscious or implicit biases that could affect the entire spectrum from the time you receive complaints until the resolution of them. And I want to focus on 2. There are obviously many more, but really the 2 that I see that are most common in investigations and receiving of complaints and resolving is affinity bias and confirmation bias. And I'm going to come back to these when we get to each of the particular stages, especially in conducting investigations, but I wanted to at least begin the course with alerting you to the dangers of this. For affinity bias, it's a tendency to believe those like me, and confirmation bias is beginning inquiries with a conclusion in mind and then essentially steering your investigation in a direction that will confirm that preset belief. For affinity bias, I have one way to quickly test yourself. And that is, think back to when the Me Too movement first started and you saw reports on the news about allegations of sexual harassment, the majority of them subordinate women saying that their bosses or more powerful men committed sexual harassment. And I want you to think of what your initial reaction was. For example, was your initial reaction to any of the allegations, you know what, this was probably just a tough boss. This was probably somebody who did something that this woman who is now claiming sexual harassment didn't like, and this is her way of getting even, essentially. Or maybe you had the complete opposite reaction and you thought to yourself, well, of course this man committed sexual harassment. There's no way that anybody would ever lie about this, and I am always going to take the side of the employee. And these might sound like extreme reactions, but think about it in your own practice and in your own workplace. Have you ever thought to yourself, not another employee complaint? These are always just things that keep me busy for no reason. Or maybe you've thought, well, yeah, of course there's a complaint against person X. I know that that person is a harasser. And that segues right into confirmation bias, which is starting out with that kind of a belief, that kind of a conclusion, and then steering your investigation in that direction. One of my favorite stories was actually one where I was an expert witness. And in that, the underlying case, the HR director had essentially received a report from an employee who had worked with a peer for some years, but that peer had recently been promoted to her manager. She came to HR and said, I haven't spoken up before because we were peers, but I want you to know that I am concerned about sexual harassment. And the first words out of the HR director's mouth were, I've seen the two of you interact, and I got to tell you, it looks like you get along just great. And so I just can't see that person ever harassing you. And reluctantly, she ended up conducting an investigation. I was hired to review it as an expert witness. And what became abundantly clear was that the entire investigation was steered in a direction to confirm that initial belief she had, which was that there's no way that that person could have committed the harassment that she was alleging. So the good news about these biases is that they can be overcome. You just need to identify them, think about them, disrupt them, and stop them from having any effect on your decision making.